Okay, hold on, hold on, hold on. I'm skipping right to the hold on part of this because it's really, really important that everyone just kind of like takes a breath before we go into this topic, both for reasons of it being really difficult to talk about and really difficult to think about, and also just because everyone has an opinion on this. Everyone has an opinion on this, and I think we all need to listen to each other. Let's approach this with an open mind because I promise I will get to it. I will discuss all the things. I will absolutely do my best, but you need to just like open your mind while I'm getting to them and just kind of bench your reactions temporarily and let them happen in response to rather than in anticipation of. Is that cool? Okay, cool. All right. Let's move on. Hi squad, welcome back, and dog bless you. This definitely won't be the only time that I address this issue. I kind of wish that it was, but it's a big one and it's very complicated, and so I'll probably come back to it again. I did my best with this. I really did. I promise. We're going to talk about detransition. And if you clicked on this video, you probably already know what it is, but just in case, detransition is pretty straightforward. It is the process of reversing a transition. It can be social, but usually it's describing the reversal of medical transition. So that's mostly what this video is going to focus on. You probably also know that it is a highly contentious topic, so that's going to be fun to talk about. Before we delve into this topic, I feel like it's really important to address that when detransition is discussed, it tends to be with this underlying assumption that the reason for it is always, or at least almost always, someone regretting their medical transition because they came to the realization that they're cis. That is not the case. I will get to it, but I figured that it was something I should mention in advance because I focus on that particular issue pretty heavily in this video. Because the idea of accidentally transitioning is pretty scary, and it's a narrative that's accessible to the majority of the population, that is, cis people. It makes sense that it would be at the forefront of most people's minds when this topic comes up. Unfortunately, this assumed commonality leads to a number of different issues. Getting right down to the bare bones of it all, what detransitioners need is support and understanding, but what they tend to get is alienation from inside the trans community and a lot of exploitation from outside the trans community. And this is regardless of how they view themselves, whether they be trans or cis. What this leads to is one of those situations where people on both sides end up hurt. And when you have a lot of hurt floating around, it makes it really, really easy for it to be exacerbated by predatory people who have their own agendas of spreading misinformation. Like I said, I will get to it, but the reason for this preamble is basically to stress the fact that this is a really complicated issue that necessitates at least some willingness to listen to opinions that you might not like. So please try to leave your knee-jerk reactions at the door, settle in, and try to give me your attention for the next 15-ish minutes, especially for someone who clicked on this video specifically to come and try and pick a fight. I'm not gonna fight you, buddy. Like, I'm not gonna do it. We listen to each other here, and we listen with intent to understand. So if you're not in a good place to do that right now, go have a snack, take a nap, and come back when you're ready to engage with compassion. The world never gets worse when you add more kindness to it, but it sure as shit gets worse when conflict brings you greater satisfaction than connecting with the people around you. There are way more effective ways to engage and get your point across. So, figure it out. So detransitioning both is and is not a trans issue. Because, as I already mentioned, the vast majority of detransitioners do continue to identify as trans after detransitioning, but even in cases where they don't, the line is very blurry because of the social salience of trans people. I'll pop a proper description up on the screen here, but to summarize it in really simple terms, trans people are really fucking noticeable, especially right now. To focus for a moment on that scary worst case scenario of a cis person experiencing transition regret because they thought they were trans, the social salience of trans people means that these people not only get talked about the most, but they get talked about in terms that basically imply that they were trans and then got better. Barring for a moment that being trans isn't an illness, it's not accurate to describe it this way any more than it would be accurate to say that somebody who engaged in same-gender intimacy at one point but then came to realize that they were actually straight is formerly gay. I mean, some people do still think that, and that is absolutely a topic for another day, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that you either are or you aren't, even if at one point you thought you might be. This framing of formerly trans or formerly gay relies on the depth of a taboo rather than an accurate assessment of the situation at hand. Because the more an identity is removed from mainstream society, the more impacted by that identity someone's narrative is when they dabble with it in any capacity. We are still working on the taboo of transness, and we're still progressing towards a point where the reaction to trans people is one of understanding and acceptance rather than neophobia. We are still starving for widespread trans representation that humanizes us and acknowledges that there is more to us and our varied identities as individuals than simply being trans.
But Finn, you have a whole YouTube channel dedicated to talking about trans issues. Why is that all you talk about?
Do you think that my online persona is exactly the same as me interacting with the rest of the, like, really? Come on now. Don't even just don't even start with that. That's, plus it's my YouTube channel. I can do what I want. But all this to say, this is a pretty big part of the reason why a lot of trans people react offensively to the topic of detransitioning. Because when you're out here fighting for rights and recognition and understanding, having those very, very limited representation slots filled by people who validate this scary worst case scenario is just really difficult. People who detransition because they realize that they are in fact cis are obviously a lot more accessible to cis people, and they tend to be subconsciously or sometimes explicitly viewed as an insight into the trans experience. And in a way, that actually makes a lot of sense. I can understand the reasoning there. These situations can give cis people some insight into what dysphoria might feel like for a lot of trans people. They identify with cis detransitioners because they can put themselves in that position of being separated from an identity that's actually comfortable for them and then put through physical changes that they later feel shackled by. Where the problem arises is that they tend to not put those last few pieces together. That is, and it feels silly saying it out loud, they go, what if cis person thinks they are trans, and don't go, what if trans person is actually trans, which is a lot more likely. They don't recognize that that terrifying scenario of being forced to go through a puberty that isn't right for you and then left to correct those misalignments and deal with all of the terrible feelings about your body that would follow from that is what a lot of trans people go through. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So this unique opportunity for insight turns into, we have to protect the cis people who might make a mistake, rather than, oh, this is what a lot of trans people feel like when we force them to live as the genders that they were assigned at birth and don't give them access to the medical resources that they need. So a lot of the reason for the defensiveness is because cis people are given a view of the trans experience that is not only incorrect, but counterproductive, because the conversation that needs to happen about it that peels back the layers and explains all of the nuance just doesn't happen. It leaves a lot of cis people with the idea that trans bodies are just ruined cis bodies, and that trans people are just misguided cis people who are waiting for that light bulb moment where they wake up and realize, ah yes, the gender that I was assigned at birth was actually right all along. This is, of course, exacerbated by the transmedicalist view of transness as being constantly at war with your body, that your relationship with your physical self is one of pain and suffering, and that you're constantly pining for something better. So all of this rambling to say that many trans people are very quick to turn on detransitioners, or anyone who expresses hesitance about approaching medical transition, or maybe thinks that some of the steps that they took in their medical transition might not have been right for them. The first glaring problem with this is that it neglects the fact that, as I already mentioned, most people who detransition continue to regard themselves as trans in some way, just not in the way that they originally thought that they might be. This means that these people still need access to trans spaces, resources, and support structures. The second problem with this is that it fuels an us and them mentality between trans people and cis people who thought at one point that they might be trans. And I think that this leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if the fear is misunderstanding and misinformation being put out there, is cutting ties with this group of people really the best way to prevent that from happening? I spent so much time thinking about how I was going to approach this one, and then I gave up on being structured, so I'm just gonna give her and hope that it makes sense. I've said it before, I'm gonna say it again. For a phenomenon to be considered commonplace, it doesn't actually have to be commonplace. Enough people just need to think that it is. And when it comes to detransition, this is very much the case. Because I could sit here and explain that detransition rates have increased proportionally with the rate of trans people accessing medical care, which is exactly what you would expect. It's really not the epidemic that certain people would have you believe it is. I could explain the fact that most people who detransition do not actually cite regret as their reason for doing so. Instead, they usually attribute it to a lack of social support, barriers in finding employment or housing, being forced to detransition by family members, health concerns, or the big one, discrimination. Anyone out here saying people transition so that they can have an easier life is, I really, really now, like, I'm not the kind of person to be like, oh, read a book, but like, read a book. Look at the new, like, why, where would you get that? I could share the fact that gender confirmation procedures actually have some of the lowest, if not the lowest, regret rates across all plastic surgeries. I could keep going back to that fact that I've mentioned once or twice now, that most detransitioners are still trans. Could maybe bring that one up again. I could do all of those things, but I'm not going to, because there's no point. That's not to say these things don't matter. These things absolutely matter. Facts matter. But when it comes to changing minds, facts have very little to do with it. Otherwise, we'd all just, agree on everything and the world would be hunky-dory. Actually solving socio-political disagreements using peer-reviewed, verifiable scientific data? What a quaint idea. Sadly, when a change that needs to happen becomes one of minds and ideas, it becomes a lot more difficult to achieve. There's a reason why changing attitudes is preceded by changing policy most of the time. People need to see that their fears aren't real, and this is hard to do if they don't have an example of this alternative reality that they're even running from in the first place. Humans are very defensive of their worldview. When they are challenged on things they know, that is read as a threat regardless of how they've come to know those things. So when someone shows up and questions your understanding of the world, they've threatened the reality that you've built your life around. They've threatened you. So if I were to sit here and explain the facts, it wouldn't actually get us anywhere, because the people who need to hear them the most are also the least likely to listen. But there's more to it than that. Stating the facts would assume that they actually care about detransitioners on a human level, and I think to some extent they might, a few of them might, or have at least convinced themselves that they do. But if there was sincere interest in reducing human suffering, where was the care and consideration beforehand? Because clearly people who realize that they're cis and then go on to detransition because they regret having done so were suffering long before they hit that point. People opposing access to transition resources claim that it's about stopping people from making a mistake and getting hurt, but I can't help but wonder why their first go-to is to take services away rather than improve the ones that are available or add more. One would think if they were sincerely concerned, they would be focused more on improving access to and quality of mental health services for trans and cis people alike. One would think that if they were really concerned about the suffering that cis detransitioners are going through, they would help dismantle this idea of trans bodies as ruined cis bodies. After all, what's the point of making them feel irreversibly damaged after the fact? Like, what is the point of that other than just contributing to the stigma? I feel like I'm just stating the obvious here, but I think that it helps to put it into words. The goal is not to prevent cis people from accidentally transitioning. The goal is to prevent trans people from existing openly. And this is problematic on its own, but the fact that detransitioners are such a huge focus in this effort adds another layer to it that is, honestly, the only word that comes to mind is despicable, because you are exploiting vulnerable people under the guise of care. Personally, I've always struggled just to understand why or how some people can hate others with such vehemence simply for being themselves. But to use the suffering of others to further that agenda of hatred is really next level. That's some comic book villain shit. If you're watching this, you're probably already familiar with the case of Kira Bell in the UK, but just in case, I'll get into it a little bit more now. Kira Bell is a detransitioned woman in the UK, so she formerly thought that she was a trans man, who sued NHS for not challenging her more on her decision to transition by beginning puberty blockers at 16 and then going on to testosterone at 17. I feel it's important to mention that she didn't have any surgical procedures until she was 20. The reason that I think that this is important to mention is not to invalidate her experiences or the suffering that she's going through, but to just stress the fact that this whole performing trans surgeries on the children is not a thing that happens. I'm not going to get into more details of the case. I might do that at a later time if that's something y'all want, but I just wanted to bring it up now because I feel like it's a pretty clear example of how TERF ideology can influence people like Kira Bell. It does this by validating a lot of the horrible things that trans people think about themselves and that detransitioned cis people think about themselves. And this is very, very clear if you just read Kira Bell's story in her own words. There's a lot of TERF rhetoric in there, pretty clearly stated. This is what happens when people get cut off from support and community. I'm not making this video to change the minds of TERFs. I'm making this video to communicate to my fellow trans people that alienating detransitioners, cutting them off from our spaces, is actually contributing to the problem. We're not only making it difficult for people who don't want to medically transition to be honest about their experiences and feel safe in our spaces, we're also leaving vulnerable people at risk of being exploited by people who have an agenda of harming us. The current conversations about detransition in the trans community are pretty heavily saturated by trans medicalists who are using it as a kind of cautionary tale to build this idea of the trans trenders and continue to, I guess, put themselves in the position of good trans in the eyes of cis people. The current conversation about detransition outside of the trans community is being led pretty heavily by transphobes who are hyperfixating on a small minority of a small minority of a small minority so that they can spread misinformation and just contribute to this whole hate brigade against us. By not talking honestly about detransition and by not platforming the voices of trans people who don't want to medically transition for whatever reason, we're making it that much easier for trans medicalists and transphobes to build this false narrative of transition regret being the most common reason for people to detransition. I do think the tides are turning on this one, so I really wanted to make this video to hopefully contribute to that shift in the conversation, which I really think needs to happen. I'm also making this video so that people who are unsure of medical transition or maybe going through it and having doubts know that they are still welcome here and that they should talk about their experiences and talk about the things they're feeling and not feel like they have to commit to things that they don't want. Those voices absolutely need to be heard. TLDR, this conversation needs to be led by supportive trans voices lest it be hijacked by hateful people who just want to hurt us. I have hit a wall with this topic for the time being, and my little jock brain can only handle so much. I hope that my ramblings have been coherent. I'll probably come back to it and follow up when I realize all of the important points that I missed, but in the meantime, please feel free to share your thoughts below. You always get me thinking on things further. Those of you who follow me more closely know that I've had some stuff on my plate recently. I am fine, and I really appreciate everyone who took the time to check in. It really does mean a lot. Like, y'all are really freaking nice. Everyone here is so nice. It's just... I know I kept delaying this video as well. This is just kind of like a heavy topic to unpack in amongst all of the other things. So yeah, I'm gonna be more honest about my schedule and what I'm capable of, and for the foreseeable future we'll be posting a video every 2 weeks to the best of my ability. So thank you all so much for your patience and for continuing to show up. It really does mean a lot. Like and subscribe if you want to throw a guy a bone in this cruel wasteland of algorithmic disregard, and I will see you next time. And as always, thanks for watching.